welcome to Story Run with Brendan, where I read a story or a poem for you. This time I'll read chapters 12 to 15 of the book called A Complete Account of the Settlement at Port Jackson by Watkin Tench. This book is about the founding years of the Port Jackson settlement. Well, let's continue. Chapter 12, Transactions of the Colony in part of December 1790. On the 9th of the month, a sergeant of marines with 3 convicts, among whom was McIntyre, the governor's gamekeeper, the person of whom Bennylong had, on former occasions, shown so much dread and hatred, went out on a shooting party. Having passed the north arm of Botany Bay, they proceeded to a hut formed of boughs, which had been lately erected on this peninsula for the accommodation of sportsmen who wished to continue by night in the woods. For as the kangaroos in the daytime chiefly keep in the cover, it is customary on these parties to sleep until near sunset and watch for the game during the night and in the early part of the morning. Accordingly, having lighted a fire, they lay down without distrust or suspicion. December 1790. About 1 o'clock the sergeant was awakened by a rustling noise in the bushes near him, and supposing it to proceed from a kangaroo, called to his comrades, who instantly jumped up. On looking about more narrowly, they saw 2 natives, with spears in their hands, creeping towards them, and 3 others a little farther behind. As this naturally created alarm, McIntyre said, "Don't be afraid, I know them," and immediately laying down his gun, stepped forward and spoke to them in their own language. The Indians, finding they were discovered, kept slowly retreating, and McIntyre accompanied them about 100 yards, talking familiarly all the while. One of them now jumped on a fallen tree, and without giving the least warning of his intention, launched his spear at McIntyre and lodged it in his left side. The person who committed this wanton act was described as a young man with a speck or blemish on his left eye. That he had been lately among us was evident from his being newly shaved. The wounded man immediately drew back, and joining his party cried, "I am a dead man," while one broke off the end of the spear. The other 2 set out with their guns in pursuit of the natives, but their swiftness on foot soon convinced our people of the impossibility of reaching them. It was now determined to attempt to carry McIntyre home, as his death was apprehended to be near, and he expressed a longing desire not to be left to expire in the woods. Being an uncommonly robust muscular man, notwithstanding a great effusion of blood, he was able, with the assistance of his comrades, to creep slowly along and reached Sydney about 2 o'clock the next morning. On the wound being examined by the surgeons, it was pronounced mortal. The poor wretch now began to utter the most dreadful exclamations, and to accuse himself of the commission of crimes of the deepest dye, accompanied with such expressions of his despair of God's mercy as are too terrible to repeat. In the course of the day, Colby and several more natives came in and were taken to the bed where the wounded man lay. Their behaviour indicated that they had already heard of the accident, as they repeated twice or thrice the name of the murderer, Pimilwi, saying that he lived at Botany Bay. To gain knowledge of their treatment of similar wounds, one of the surgeons made signs of extracting the spear, but this they violently opposed and said if it were done, death would instantly follow. On the 12th, the extraction of the spear was, however, judged practicable, and was accordingly performed. That part of it which had penetrated the body measured 7 inches and a half long, having on it a wooden barb and several smaller ones of stone, fastened on with yellow gum, most of which, owing to the force necessary in extraction, were torn off and lodged in the patient. The spear had passed between 2 ribs, and had wounded the left lobe of the lungs. He lingered until the 20th of January, and then expired. Side note: from the aversion uniformly shown by all the natives to this unhappy man, he had long been suspected by us of having in his excursions shot and injured them. To gain information on this head from him, the moment of contrition was seized. On being questioned with great seriousness, he however declared that he had never fired but once on a native, and then had not killed, but severely wounded him, and this in his own defence. Notwithstanding this deathbed confession, most people doubted the truth of the relation, from his general character and other circumstances. Back to the main text. On opening the corpse, it was found that the left lung had perished from suppuration. That means the formation or discharge of pus. It remains adhering to the ribs. Some pieces of stone, which had dropped from the spear, were seen, but no barb of wood. December 1790. The governor was at Rose Hill when this accident happened. On the day after he returned to Sydney, the following order was issued. Several tribes of the natives still continuing to throw spears at any man they meet unarmed, by which several have been killed or dangerously wounded. The governor, in order to deter the natives from such practices in future, has ordered out a party to search for the man who wounded the convict McIntyre in so dangerous a manner on Friday last, though no offence was offered on his part, in order to make a signal example of that tribe. At the same time, the governor strictly forbids, under the penalty of the severest punishment, any soldier or other person not expressly ordered out for that purpose, ever to fire on any native except in his own defence, or to molest him in any shape, or to bring away any spears or other articles which they may find belonging to those people. The natives will be made severe examples of whenever any man is wounded by them, but this will be done in a manner which may satisfy them, that it is a punishment inflicted on them for their own bad conduct, and of which they cannot be made sensible if they are not treated with kindness, while they continue peaceable and quiet. A party consisting of 2 captains, 2 subalterns, and 40 privates, with a proper number of non-commissioned officers from the garrison, with 3 days' provisions, and etc., are to be ready to march tomorrow morning at daylight, in order to bring in 6 of those natives who reside near the head of Botany Bay, or, if that should be found impracticable, to put that number to death. Just previous to this order being issued, the author of this publication received a direction to attend the governor at headquarters immediately. I went, and His Excellency informed me that he had pitched upon me to execute the foregoing command. He added that the 2 subalterns who were to be drawn from the Marine Corps should be chosen by myself, that the sergeant and the 2 convicts who were with McIntyre should attend as guides, that we were to proceed to the peninsula at the head of Botany Bay, and thence, or from any part of the north arm of the bay, we were, if practicable, to bring away 2 natives as prisoners, and to put to death 10, that we were to destroy all weapons of war, but nothing else, that no hut was to be burned, that all women and children were to remain uninjured, not being comprehended within the scope of the order, that our operations were to be directed either by surprise or open force, that after we had made any prisoners or communication, even with those natives with whom we were in habits of intercourse, was to be avoided, and none of them suffered to approach us, that we were to cut off and bring in the heads of the slain. Who were the savages? Hatchets and bags would be furnished, and finally, that no signal of amity or invitation should be used, in order to allure them to us, or if made on their part, to be answered by us, for that such conduct would be not only present treachery, but give them reason to distrust every future mark of peace and friendship on our part. December 1790. His Excellency was now pleased to enter into the reasons which had introduced him to adopt measures of such severity. He said that since our arrival in the country, no less than 17 of our people had either been killed or wounded by the natives, that he looked upon the tribe known by the name of Biddigal, living on the before-mentioned peninsula and chiefly on the north arm of Botany Bay, to be the principal aggressors or defenders. That against this tribe he was determined to strike a decisive blow in order at once to convince them of our superiority and to infuse a universal terror which might operate to prevent further mischief. That his observations on the natives had led him to conclude that although they did not fear death individually, yet that the relative weight and importance of the different tribes appeared to be the highest object of their estimation, as each tribe deemed its strength and security to consist wholly in its powers aggregately considered. That his motive for having so long delayed to use violent measures had arisen from believing that in every former instance of hostility they had acted either from having received injury or from misapprehension. To the latter of these causes, added he, I attribute my own wound, but in this business of McIntyre I am fully persuaded that they were unprovoked, and the barbarity of their conduct admits of no extenuation, for I have separately examined the sergeant, of whose veracity I have the highest opinion, and the two convicts, and their story is short, simple, and alike. I have in vain tried to stimulate Bennelong, Colby, and the other natives who live among us to bring in the aggressor. Yesterday, indeed, they promised me to do it, and actually went away, as if bent on such a design. But Bennelong, instead of directing his steps to Botany Bay, crossed the harbour in his canoe, in order to draw the foreteeth of some of the young men, and Colby, in the room of fulfilling his engagement, is loitering about the lookout house. Nay, so far from wishing even to describe faithfully the person of the man who has thrown the spear, they pretended that he has a distorted foot, which is a palpable falsehood, so that we have our efforts only to depend upon, and I am resolved to execute the prisoners who may be brought in the most public and exemplary manner, in the presence of as many of their countrymen as can be collected, after having explained the cause of such a punishment, and my fixed determination to repeat it, whenever any future breach of good conduct on their side shall render it necessary. Here the governor stopped, and addressing himself to me, said, if I could propose any alteration of the orders under which I was to act, he would patiently listen to me. Encouraged by this condescension, I begged leave to offer for consideration whether, instead of destroying 10 persons, the capture of 6 would not better answer all the purposes for which the expedition was to be undertaken, as out of this number a part might be set aside for retaliation, and the rest at the proper time liberated, after having seen the fate of their comrades, and been made sensible of the cause of their own detention. December 1790. This scheme His Excellency was pleased instantly to adopt, adding, if 6 cannot be taken, let this number be shot. Should you, however, find it practicable to take so many, I will hang 2 and send the rest to Norfolk Island for a certain period, which will cause their countrymen to believe that we have dispatched them secretly. The order was accordingly altered to its present form, and I took my leave to prepare, after being again cautioned not to deceive by holding signals of amity. At 4 o'clock on the morning of the 14th we marched. The detachment consisted, besides myself, of Captain Hill of the New South Wales Corps, Lieutenants Polden and Dawes of the Marines, Mr. Morgan and Mr. Lowes, surgeons, 3 sergeants, 3 corporals, and 40 private soldiers, provided with 3 days' provisions, ropes to bind our prisoners with, and hatchets and bags to cut off and contain the heads of the slain. By 9 o'clock this terrific procession reached the peninsula at the head of Botany Bay. But after having walked in various directions until 4 o'clock in the afternoon without seeing a native, we halted for the night. At daylight on the following morning, our search recommenced. We marched in an easterly direction, intending to fall in with the southwest arm of the bay, about 3 miles above its mouth, which we determined to scour, and thence passing along the head of the peninsula to proceed to the north arm and complete our search. However, by a mistake of our guides, at 7:30 o'clock, instead of finding ourselves on the southwest arm, we came suddenly upon the seashore at the head of the peninsula, about midway between the two arms. Here we saw 5 Indians on the beach, whom we attempted to surround, but they penetrated our design, and before we could get near enough to effect our purpose, ran off. We pursued, but a contest between heavy-armed Europeans, fettered by ligatures and naked, unencumbered Indians, was too unequal to last long. They darted into the wood and disappeared. December 1790. The alarm being given, we were sensible that no hope of success remained, but by a rapid movement to a little village, if 5 huts deserve the name, which we knew stood on the nearest point of the north arm, where possibly someone unapprised of our approach might yet be found. Thither we hastened, but before we could reach it, 3 canoes filled with Indians were seen paddling over in the utmost hurry and trepidation to the opposite shore, where universal alarm prevailed. All we could now do was to search the huts for weapons of war, but we found nothing except fish gigs, which we left untouched. On our return to our baggage, which we had left behind under a small guard near the place where the pursuit had begun, we observed a native fishing in shallow water not higher than his waist, at a distance of 300 yards from the land. It's about 100 metres. In such a situation, it should not have been easily practicable either to shoot or seize him. I therefore determined to pass without noticing him, as he seemed either from consciousness of his own security or from some other cause quite unintimidated at our appearance. At length he called to several of us by name, and in spite of our formidable array, drew nearer with unbounded confidence. Surprised at his behaviour, I ordered a halt, that he might overtake us, fully resolved, whoever he might be, that he should be suffered to come to us and leave us uninjured. Presently we found it to be our friend Colby, and he joined us at once, with his wonted familiarity and unconcern. We asked him where Pimilwy was, and found that he perfectly comprehended the nature of our errand, for he described him to have fled to the southward, and to be at such a distance as, had we known the account to be true, would have prevented our going in search of him without a fresh supply of provisions. When we arrived at our baggage, Colby sat down, ate, drank, and slept with us from 10 o'clock until past noon. We asked him several questions about Sydney, which he had left on the preceding day. Side note: he had, it seems, visited the governor about noon, after having gained information from Nangbury of our march, and for what purpose it was undertaken. This he did not scruple to tell to the governor, proclaiming at the same time a resolution of going to Botany Bay, which his excellency endeavoured to dissuade him from by every argument he could devise. A blanket, a hatchet, a jacket, or aught else he would ask for, was ordered to him in vain. If he would not go, at last it was determined to try to eat him down, by setting before him his favourite food, of which it was hoped he would feed so voraciously as to render him incapable of executing his intention. A large dish of fish was accordingly set before him, but after devouring a light horseman and at least 5 pounds of beef and bread, even until the sight of food became disgusting to him, he set out on his journey with such lightness and gaiety as plainly showed him to be a stranger to the horrors of indigestion. Back to the main text. And told us He had been present at an operation performed at the hospital where Mr. White had cut off a woman's leg. The agony and cries of the poor sufferer he depicted in a most lively manner. At 1 o'clock we renewed our march, and at 3 halted near a freshwater swamp, where we resolved to remain until morning, that is, after a day of severe fatigue, to pass a night of restless inquietude, when weariness is denied repose by swarms of mosquitoes and sandflies, which in the summer months bite and sting the traveller without measure or intermission. Next morning we bent our steps homeward, and after wading breast high through 2 arms of the sea, as broad as the Thames at Westminster, were glad to find ourselves at Sydney between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The few remarks which I was able to make on the country through which we had passed were such as will not tempt adventurers to visit it on the score of pleasure or advantage. The soil of every part of the peninsula which we had traversed is shallow and sandy, and its productions meagre and wretched. When forced to quit the sand, we were condemned to drag through morasses or to clamber over rocks, unrefreshed by streams and unmarked by diversity. Of the soil I brought away several specimens. Our first expedition having so totally failed, the governor resolved to try the fate of a second, and the painful preeminence again devolved on me. December 1790. The orders under which I was commanded to act differing in no respect from the last, I resolved to try once more to surprise the village before mentioned, and in order to deceive the natives, and prevent them from again frustrating our design by promulging it, we feigned that our preparations were directed against Broken Bay, and that the man who had wounded the governor was the object of punishment. It was now also determined, by being full moon, that our operations should be carried out in the night, both for the sake of secrecy and for avoiding the extreme heat of the day. A little before sunset on the evening of the 22nd we marched. Lieutenant Abbott and Ensign Prentice of the New South Wales Corps were the 2 officers under my command, and with 3 sergeants, 3 corporals, and 30 privates, completed the detachment. We proceeded directly to the fords of the north arm of Botany Bay, which we had crossed in our last expedition, on the banks of which we were compelled to wait until 2:15 in the morning for the ebb of the tide. As these passing places consist only of narrow slips of ground, on each side of which are dangerous holes, and as fording rivers in the night is at all times an unpleasant task, I determined before we entered the water to disburthen the men as much as possible, that in case of stepping wrong, every one might be as ready as circumstances would admit to recover himself. The firelock and cartouche box were all that we carried, the latter tied fast on the top of the head. The knapsacks, etc., I left in charge of a sergeant and 6 men, who from their low stature and other causes were most likely to impede our march, the success of which I knew hinged on our ability by a rapid movement to surprise the village before daybreak. The 2 rivers were crossed without any material accident, and in pursuit of my resolution, I ordered the guides to conduct us by the nearest road, without heeding difficulty or implement of road. Having continued to push along the river bank very briskly for 3/4 of an hour, we were suddenly stopped by a creek, about 60 yards wide, which extended to our right, and appeared dry from the tide being out. I asked if it could be passed, or whether it would be better to wheel round the head of it. Our guides answered that it was bad to cross, but might be got over, which would save us more than 1/4 of a mile. That's about 400 metres. Knowing the value of time, I directly bade them to push through, and everyone began to follow as well as he could. They who were foremost had not, however, got above half over when the difficulty of progress was sensibly experienced. We were immersed nearly to the waist in mud, so thick and tenacious that it was not without the most vigorous exertion of every muscle of the body that the legs could be disengaged. When we had reached the middle, our distress became not only more pressing but serious, and each succeeding step buried us deeper. At length a sergeant of grenadiers stuck fast and declared himself incapable of moving either forward or backward, and just after Ensign Prentice and I felt ourselves in a similar predicament, close together. I find it impossible to move. I am sinking, resounding on every side. What to do I knew not. Every moment brought increase of perplexity and augmented danger. As those who could not proceed kept gradually subsiding from our misfortunes, however, those in the rear profited. Warned by what they saw and heard, they inclined to the right towards the head of the creek, and thereby contrived to pass over. December 1790. Our distress would have terminated fatally had not a soldier cried out to those on shore to cut boughs of trees and throw them to us. Side note: I had often read of this contrivance to facilitate the passage of a morass, but I confess that in my confusion I had entirely forgotten it, and probably should have continued to do so until too late to be of use. Back to the main text. A lucky thought, which certainly saved many of us from perishing miserably, and even with this assistance, had we been burdened by our knapsacks, we could not have emerged, for it employed us near half an hour to disentangle some of our number. The sergeant of grenadiers, in particular, was sunk to his breastbone and so firmly fixed in that the efforts of many men were required to extricate him, which was effected in the moment after I had ordered one of the ropes destined to bind the captive Indians to be fastened under his arms. Having congratulated each other on our escape from this Sabonian bog, and wiped our arms, half of which were rendered unserviceable by the mud, we once more pushed forward to our object, within a few hundred yards of which we found ourselves about half an hour before sunrise. Here I formed a detachment into 3 divisions, and having enjoined the most perfect silence, in order, if possible, to deceive Indian vigilance, each division was directed to take a different route, so as to meet at the village at the same moment. We rushed rapidly on, and nothing could succeed more exactly than the arrival of the several detachments. To our astonishment, however, we found not a single native at the huts, nor was a canoe to be seen on any part of the bay. I was at first inclined to attribute this to our arriving half an hour too late, from the numberless impediments we had encountered, but on closer examination there appeared room to believe that many days had elapsed since an Indian had been on the spot, as no mark of fresh fires or fish bones was to be found. Disappointed and fatigued, we would willingly have profited by the advantage of being near water, and have halted to refresh, but on consultation it was found that unless we reached in an hour the rivers we had so lately passed, it would be impossible on account of the tide to cross to our baggage, in which case we should be without food until evening. We therefore pushed back, and by dint of alternately running and walking, arrived at the fords time enough to pass with ease and safety. So excessive, however, had been our efforts, and so laborious our progress, that several of the soldiers in the course of the last 2 miles gave up, and confessed themselves unable to proceed further. All that I could do for these poor fellows was to order their comrades to carry their muskets, and to leave with them a small party of those men who were least exhausted to assist them and hurry them on. In 3/4 of an hour after we had crossed the water, they arrived at it, just time enough to effect a passage. The necessity of repose, joined to the succeeding heat of the day, induced us to prolong our halt until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when we recommenced our operations on the opposite side of the north arm to that we had acted upon in the morning. Our march ended at sunset, without our seeing a single native. We had passed through the country which the discoverers of Botany Bay extol as some of the finest meadows in the world. Side note, the words which are quoted may be found in Mr. Cook's first voyage, and form part of his description of Botany Bay. It has often fallen to my lot to traverse these fabled plains, and many a bitter execration have I heard poured on those travellers, who could so faithlessly relate what they saw. Back to the main text. These meadows, instead of grass, were covered with high, coarse rushes, growing in a rotten, spongy bog, into which we were plunged knee-deep at every step. Our final effort was made at 1:30 next morning, and after 4 hours' toil, ended as those preceding it had done, in disappointment and vexation. At 9 o'clock we returned to Sydney to report our fruitless peregrination. December 1790. But if we could not retaliate on the murder of McIntyre, we found no difficulty in punishing offences committed within our own observation. 2 natives about this time were detected in robbing a potato garden. When seen, they ran away, and a sergeant and a party of soldiers were dispatched in pursuit of them. Unluckily, it was dark when they overtook them, with some woman at a fire, and the ardour of the soldiers transported them so far that, instead of capturing the offenders, they fired in among them. The women were taken, but the 2 men escaped. On the following day, blood was traced from the fireplace to the seaside, where it seemed probable that those who had lost it had embarked. The natives were observed to become immediately shy, but an exact knowledge of the mischief which had been committed was not gained until the end of 2 days, when they said that a man of the name of Bangai, who was known to be one of the pilferers, was wounded and dead. Imirawani, however, whispered that though he was wounded, he was not dead. A hope now existed that his life might be saved, and Mr. White, taking Imawarani, Nyangbury, and a woman with him, set out for the spot where he was reported to be. But on their reaching it, they were told by some people who were there that the man was dead, and that the corpse was deposited in a bay about a mile off. Thither they accordingly repaired, and found it as described, covered except one leg, which seemed to be designedly left bare, with green boughs and a fire burning near it. Those who had performed the funeral obsequies seemed to have been particularly solicitous for the protection of the face, which was covered with a thick branch, interwoven with grass and fern, so as to form a complete screen. Around the neck was a strip of the bark of which they were making fishing lines, and a young straight stick growing near was stripped of its bark and bent down so as to form an arch over the body, in which position it was confined by a forked branch stuck into the earth. December 1790. On examining the corpse, it was found to be warm. Through the shoulder had passed a musket ball, which had divided the subclavian artery and caused death by loss of blood. No mark of any remedy having been applied could be discovered. Possibly the nature of the wound, which even among us would baffle cure without amputation of the arm at the shoulder, was deemed so fatal that they despaired of success, and therefore left it to itself. Had Mr. White found the man alive, there was little room to think that he could have been of any use to him. For that an Indian would submit to so formidable and alarming an operation seemed hardly probable. None of the natives who had come in the boat would touch the body, or even go near it, saying the morn would come. That is, literally, the spirit of the deceased would seize them. Of the people who died among us, they had expressed no such apprehension. But how far the difference of a natural death and one affected by violence may operate on their fears to induce superstition, and why those who had performed the rites of sepulture should not experience similar fears and reluctance. I have to be determined, certain it is, as I shall insist upon more hereafter, that they believe the spirit of the dead not to be extinct within the body. Banilong took an odd method of revenging the death of his countrymen. At the head of several of his tribe, he robbed one of the private boats of fish, threatening the people who were unarmed that in case they resisted, he would spear them. On being taxed by the governor with this outrage, he at first stoutly denied it, but on being confronted with the people who were in the boat, he changed his language and, without deigning even to palliate his offence, burst into fury and demanded who had killed Bangai. Chapter 13. The transactions of the colony continued to the end of May 1791. December 1790. The Dutch snow from Batavia arrived on the 17th of the month, after a passage of 12 weeks in which she had lost 16 of her people in Indonesia. But death to a man who has resided at Batavia is too familiar an object to excite either terror or regret. All the people of the Supply who were left there sick, except one midshipman, had also perished in that fatal climate. The cargo of the Snow consisted chiefly of rice, with a small quantity of beef, pork, and flour. A letter was received by this vessel, written by the Shebander at Batavia to Governor Philip, acquainting him that war had commenced between England and Spain. As this letter was written in the Dutch language, we did not find it easy of translation. It filled us, however, with anxious perturbation, and with wishes as impotent as they were eager, in the case of our country, though far beyond the dins of arms, we longed to contribute to her glory, and to share in her triumphs. Placed out of the reach of attack, both by remoteness and insignificancy, our only dread lay lest those supplies intended for our consumption should be captured, not however to be found totally unprovided. In case an enemy should appear, a battery was planned near the entrance of Sydney Cove, and other formidable preparations set on foot. The commencement of the year 1790, though marked by no circumstances particularly favourable, being far less inauspicious than that of 1790 had done. January 1791. No circumstance, however apparently trivial, which can tend to throw light on a new country, either in respect of its present situation or its future promise, should pass unregarded. On the 24th of January, 2 bunches of grapes were cut in the governor's garden from cuttings of vines brought 3 years before from the Cape of Good Hope. The bunches were handsome, the fruit of a moderate size, but well filled out, and the flavour high and delicious. The first step after unloading the Dutch Snow was to dispatch the supply to Norfolk Island for Captain Hunter and the crew of the Sirius, who had remained there ever since the loss of that ship. It had always been the governor's wish to hire the Dutchmen for the purpose of transporting them to England, but the frantic, extravagant behaviour of the master of her for a long time frustrated the conclusion of a contract. He was so totally lost to a sense of reason and propriety as to ask £11 per ton monthly for her use, until she should arrive from England at Batavia. So for the £11 per ton, in today's money, that's about £1,400, or about $2,700 in Australian. This was treated with proper contempt, and he was at last induced to accept 20 shillings a ton per month, rating her at 300 tons until she should arrive in England. And there are 20 shillings in a pound, so that works out to be reduced to £1 per ton per month, being about the 25th part of his original demand. And even at this price, she was perhaps the dearest vessel ever hired on a similar service, being totally destitute of every accommodation and every good quality which could promise to render so long a voyage either comfortable or expeditious. February 1791. On the 26th, Captain Hunter, his officers and ship's company joined us, and on the 28th of March, the snow sailed with them for England, intending to make a northern passage by Timor and Batavia, the season being too far advanced to render the southern route by Cape Horn practicable. Side note, they did not arrive in England until April 1792. Back to the main text. 6 days previous to the departure of Captain Hunter, the Indefatigable Supply again sailed for Norfolk Island, carrying thither Captain Hill and a detachment of the New South Wales Corps. A little navy boy named Bondell, who had long particularly attached himself to Captain Hill, accompanied him, at his own earnest request. His father had been killed in battle, and his mother bitten in two by a shark, so that he was an orphan, dependent on the humanity of his tribe for protection. Side note, I am of opinion that such protection is always extended to children who may be left destitute. Back to the main text. His disappearance seemed to make no impression on the rest of his countrymen, who were apprised of his resolution to go. On the return of the supply, they inquired eagerly for him, and on being told that the place he was gone to afforded plenty of birds and other good fare, innumerable volunteers presented themselves to follow him. So great was their confidence in us, and so little hold of them had the amour patrie, that's the love of your country. March 1791. The snow had but just sailed, when a very daring manoeuvre was carried into execution, with complete success, by a set of convicts, 11 in number, including a woman, wife of one of the party, and 2 little children. They seized the governor's cutter, and putting into her a seine, fishing lines and hooks, firearms, a quadrant, compass, and some provisions, boldly pushed out to sea, determined to brave every danger and combat every hardship, rather than remain longer in a captive state. Most of these people had been brought out in the first fleet, and the terms of transportation of some of them were expired. Among them were a fisherman, a carpenter, and some competent navigators, so that little doubt was entertained that a scheme so admirably planned would be adequately executed. Side note, it was my fate to fall in again with part of this little band of adventurers. In March 1792, when I arrived in the Gorgon at the Cape of Good Hope, 6 of these people, including the woman and 1 child, were put on board of us to be carried to England. 4 had died and 1 had jumped overboard at Batavia. The particulars of their voyage were briefly as follows. They coasted the shore of New Holland, putting occasionally into different harbours, which they found in going along. One of these harbours, in the latitude of 30 degrees south, they described to be of superior excellence and capacity. Here they hauled their bark ashore, paid her seams with tallow, and repaired her. But it was with difficulty they could keep off the attacks of the Indians. These people continued to harass them so much that they quitted the mainland and retreated to a small island in the harbour, where they completed their design. Between the latitude of 26 degrees and 27 degrees, they were driven by a current 30 leagues from the shore, among some islands, where they found plenty of large turtles. Soon after, they closed again with the continent, when the boat got entangled in the surf, and was driven on shore, and they had all well nigh perished. They passed through the Straits of Endeavour, and beyond the Gulf of Carpentaria, found a large freshwater river, which they entered, and filled from it their empty casks. Until they reached the Gulf of Carpentaria, they saw no natives or canoes differing from those about Port Jackson, but now they were chased by large canoes, fitted with sails and fighting stages, and capable of holding 30 men each. They escaped by dint of rowing to windward. On the 5th of June 1791 they reached Timor, and pretended that they had belonged to a ship, which on her passage from Port Jackson to India had foundered, and that they only had escaped. The Dutch received them with kindness, and treated them with hospitality, but their behaviour giving rise to suspicion, they were watched, and one of them at last, in a moment of intoxication, betrayed the secret. They were immediately secured and committed to prison. Soon after, Captain Edwards of the Pandora, who had been wrecked near Endeavour Straits, arrived at Timor, and they were delivered up to him, by which means they became passengers in the Gorgon. I confess that I never looked at these people without pity and astonishment. They had miscarried in a heroic struggle for liberty, after having combated every hardship and conquered every difficulty. The woman and one of the men had gone out to Port Jackson in the ship which had transported me thither. They had both of them been always distinguished for good behaviour, and I could not but reflect with admiration at the strange combination of circumstances which had again brought us together, to baffle human foresight and confound human speculation. Back to the main text. When their elopement was discovered, a pursuit was ordered by the governor, but the fugitives had made too good a use of the intermediate time to be even seen by their pursuers. After the escape of Captain Bligh, which was well known to us, no length of passage or hazard of navigation seemed above human accomplishment. However, to prevent future attempts of a like nature, the governor directed that boats only of stated dimensions should be built. Indeed, an order of this sort had been issued on the escape of the first party, and it was now repeated with additional restrictions. April 1791. Notwithstanding the supplies which had recently arrived from Batavia, short allowance was again proclaimed on the 2nd of April, on which day we reduced to the following ration: 3 pounds of rice, 3 pounds of flour, and 3 pounds of pork per week. It was singularly unfortunate that the retrenchments should always happen when the gardens were most destitute of vegetables. A long drought had nearly exhausted them. The hardships which we were in consequence suffered were great, but not comparable to what had been formerly experienced. Besides, now we made sure of ships arriving soon to dispel our distress, whereas heretofore, from having never heard from England, the hearts of men sunk, and many had begun to doubt whether it had not been resolved to try how long misery might be endured with resignation. Notwithstanding the incompetency of so diminished a pittance, the daily task of the soldier and convict continued unaltered. I never contemplated the labours of these men without finding abundant cause of reflection on the miseries which our nature can overcome. Let me for a moment quit the cold track of narrative. Let me not fritter away by servile adaptation those reflections and the feelings they gave birth to. Let me transcribe them fresh as they arose, ardent and generous, though hopeless and romantic. I every day see wretches pale with disease and wasted with famine struggle against the horrors of their situation. How striking is the effect of subordination! How dreadful is the fear of punishment! The allotment task is still performed even on the present reduced subsistence. The blacksmith sweats at the sultry forge, the sawyer labours pent up in his pit, and the husbandman turns up the sterile glebe. Shall I again hear arguments multiplied to violate truth and insult humanity? Shall I again be told that the sufferings of the wretched Africans are indispensable for the culture of our sugar colonies? That white men are incapable of sustaining the heat of the climate? I have been in the West Indies. I have lived there. I know that it is a rare instance for the mercury in the thermometer to mount over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and here I scarcely pass a week in summer without seeing it rise to 100 degrees, sometimes 105. 100 degrees Fahrenheit is about 37 degrees Celsius. 105 degrees is about 40 degrees Celsius, nay, beyond even that burning altitude. But toil cannot be long supported without adequate refreshment. The first step in every community which wishes to preserve honesty should be to set the people above want. The throes of hunger will ever prove too powerful for integrity to withstand. Hence arose a repetition of petty delinquencies which no vigilance could detect and no justice reach. Gardens were plundered, provisions pilfered, and the Indian corn stolen from the fields, where it grew for public use. Various were the measures adopted to check this depredatory spirit. Criminal courts either from the tediousness of their process or from the frequent escape of culprits from their decision, were seldomer convened than formerly. The governor ordered convict offenders either to be chained together or to wear singly a large iron collar with 2 spikes projecting from it, which effectively hindered the party from concealing it under his shirt, and thus shackled they were compelled to perform their quota of work. May 1791. Had their marauding career terminated here, humanity would have been anxious to plead in their defence, but the natives continued to complain of being robbed of spears and fishing tackle. Our convict was at length taken in the fact of stealing fishing tackle from Dainga, the wife of Colby. The governor ordered that he should be severely flogged, in the presence of as many natives as could be assembled, to whom the cause of punishment should be explained. Many of them, of both sexes, accordingly attended. Arabanee's aversion to a similar sight has been noticed, and if the behaviour of those now collected be found to correspond with it, it is, I think, fair to conclude that these people are not of a sanguinary and implacable temper. Means they don't want bloodshed. They're not vengeful. Quick indeed of resentment, but not unforgiving of injury. There was not one of them that did not testify strong abhorrence of the punishment, and equal sympathy with the sufferer. The women were particularly affected. Daringa shed tears, and Barangaroo, kindling into anger, snatched a stick and menaced the executioner. The conduct of these women on this occasion was exactly descriptive of their characters. The former was ever meek and feminine, the latter fierce and unsubmissive. 1791. On the 1st of May, many allotments of ground were parcelled out by the governor to convicts, whose periods of transportation were expired, and who voluntarily offered to become settlers in the country. The terms on which they settled, and their progress in agriculture, will be hereafter set forth. Chapter 14. Travelling Diaries in New South Wales. From among my numerous travelling journals into the interior parts of the country, I select the following to present to the reader, as equally important in their object and more amusing in their detail than any other. In April 1791, an expedition was undertaken in order to ascertain whether or not the Hawkesbury and the Nepean were the same river. With this view, we proposed to fall in a little above Richmond Hill. Side note, look at the map for the situation of this place. And back to the main text, and trace down to it, and if the weather should prove fine, to cross at the ford and go a short distance westward, then to repass the river and trace it upward, until we should either arrive at some spot which we knew to be the Nepean, or should determine by its course that the Hawkesbury was a different stream. 1791. Our party was strong and numerous. It consisted of 21 persons, viz. The governor, Mr. Collins, and his servant, Mr. White, Mr. Dawes, the author, 3 gamekeepers, 2 sergeants, 8 privates, and our friends Colby and Ballandery. These 2 last were volunteers on the occasion, on being assured that we should not stay out many days, and that we should carry plenty of provisions. Bennylon wished to go, but his wife would not permit it. Colby, on the other hand, would listen to no objections. He only stipulated, with great care and consideration, that during his absence his wife and child should remain at Sydney under our protection, and be supplied with provisions. But before we set out, let me describe our equipment, and try to convey to those who have rolled along on turnpike roads only, an account of those preparations which are required to traversing the wilderness. Every man, the governor excepted, carried his own knapsack, which contained provisions for 10 days. If to this be added a gun, a blanket, and a canteen, the weight will fall nothing short of 40 pounds, 20 kg. Slung to the knapsack are the cooking kettle and the hatchet, with which the wood to kindle the nightly fire and build the nightly hut is to be cut down. Carp to drag through morasses, tear through thickets, ford rivers, and scale rocks. Our autumnal heroes, who annually seek the hills in pursuit of grouse, and black game afford but an imperfect representation of the picture. Thus encumbered, the march begins at sunrise, and with occasional halts continues until about an hour and a half before sunset. It is necessary to stop thus early to prepare for passing the night. For toil here ends not with the march. Instead of the cheering blaze, the welcoming landlord, and the long bill of fare, the traveller has now to collect his fuel, to erect his wigwam, to fetch water, and to broil his morsel of salt pork. A wigwam is a domed structure made from branches for the support structure and bark for the outer covering. Let him then lie down, and if it be summer, try whether the effect of fatigue is sufficiently powerful to overcome the bites and stings of the myriads of sand flies and mosquitoes which buzz around him. Monday, April 11th, 1791. At 20 minutes before 7 o'clock, we started from the Governor's house at Rose Hill and steered. Side note: our method on these expeditions was to steer by compass, noting the different courses as we proceeded, and counting the number of paces, of which 2,200 on good ground were allowed to be a mile. At night, when we halted, all these courses were separately cast up and worked by a traverse table in the manner of a ship's reckoning is kept, so that by observing this precaution we always knew exactly where we were and how far from home, an unspeakable advantage in the new country, where one hill and one tree is so like another that fatal wanderings would ensue without it. This audacious task was always allotted to Mr. Dawes, who, from habit and superior skill, performed it almost without a stop, or an interruption of conversation, to any other man on such terms. It would have been impracticable. Back to the main text. So we started from the Governor's house at Rose Hill, and steered for a short time, nearly in a north-east direction, after which we turned to north 34 degrees west, and steadily pursued that course until a quarter before 4 o'clock, when we halted for the night. The country for the first 2 miles, a bit over 3 kilometres, while we walked to the north-east, was good, full of grass, without rock or underwood. Afterwards it grew very bad, being full of steep barren rocks, over which we were compelled to clamber for 7 miles, a bit over 11 kilometres, when it changed to a plain country, apparently very sterile and with very little grass in it, which rendered walking easy. Our fatigue in the morning had, however, been so oppressive that one of the party knocked up, and had not a soldier as strong as a pack horse undertaken to carry his knapsack in addition to his own, we must either have sent him back or have stopped at a place for the night which did not afford water. Our 2 natives carried each his pack, but its weight was inconsiderable, most of their provisions being in the knapsacks of the soldiers and gamekeepers. We expected to have derived from them much information relating to the country, as no one doubted that they were acquainted with every part of it between the sea coast and the river Hawkesbury. We hoped also to have witnessed their manner of living in the woods, and the resources they rely upon in their journeys. Nothing, however, of this sort had yet occurred, except their examining some trees to see if they could discover on the bark any marks of the claws of squirrels and opossums, which they said would show whether any of the other animals were hidden among the leaves and branches. They walked stoutly, appeared but little fatigued, and maintained their spirits admirably, laughing to excess when any of us either tripped or stumbled, misfortunes which much seldomer fell to their lot than to ours. At a very short distance from Rose Hill, we found that they were in a country unknown to them, so that the farther they went, the more dependent on us they became, being absolute strangers inland. To convey to their understandings the intention of our journey was impossible, for perhaps no words could unfold to an Indian the motives of curiosity, which induce men to encounter labour, fatigue, and pain, when they might remain in repose at home, with a sufficiency of food. We asked Colby the name of the people who lived inland, and he called them Buru-Bur-on-Gal, and said they were bad, whence we conjectured that they sometimes war with those on the sea coast.
by whom they were undoubtedly driven up the country from the fishing ground, that it might not be overstocked. The weak are here, as in every other country, giving way to the stronger. We asked how they lived. He said on birds and animals, having no fish. Their laziness appeared strongly when we halted, for they refused to draw water, or to cleave wood to make a fire, but as soon as it was kindled, having first well stuffed themselves, they lay down before it and fell asleep. About an hour after sunset, as we were chatting by the fireside and preparing to go rest, we heard voices at a little distance in the wood. Our natives catched the sound instantaneously, and bidding us be silent, listened attentively to the quarter whence it had proceeded. In a few minutes we heard the voices plainly, and wishing exceedingly to open a communication with this tribe, we begged our natives to call to them and bid them to come to us, to assure them of good treatment, and that they should have something given them to eat. Colby no longer hesitated, but gave them a signal of invitation in a loud hollow cry. After some whooping and shouting on both sides, a man with a lighted stick in his hand advanced near enough to converse with us. The first words which we could distinctly understand were, "I am Colby of the tribe Cadigal." The stranger replied, "I am Buriwan of the tribe Oburuburungal." Baldery informed him also of his name, and that we were white men and friends. He would give him something to eat. Still he seemed irresolute. Colby therefore advanced to him, took him by the hand, and led him to us. By the light of the moon we were introduced to this gentleman, all our names being repeated in form by our two masters of the ceremonies, who said that we were Englishmen, and Bajiri, good, that we came from the sea coast, and that we were travelling inland. Biriwan seemed to be a man about 30 years old, differing in no respect from his countrymen with whom we were acquainted. He came to us unarmed, having left his spear at a little distance. After a long conversation with his countrymen, and having received some provisions, he departed highly satisfied. Tuesday, April 12th, 1791. Started this morning at 6:30 o'clock, and in 2 hours reached the river. The whole of the country we passed was poor, and the soil within a mile of the river changed to a course deep in sand, which I have invariably found to compose its banks in every part without exception that I have ever saw. The stream at this place is about 350 feet wide, the water pure and excellent to the taste. The banks are about 20 feet high, it's about 6 meters, and covered with trees, many of which had been evidently bent by the force of the current in the direction which it runs, and some of them contain rubbish and driftwood in their branches, at least 45 feet above the level of the stream. We saw many ducks and killed one, which Colby swam for. No new production among the shrubs growing here was found. We were acquainted with them all. Our natives had evidently never seen this river before. They stared at it with surprise and talked to each other. The total ignorance of the country and of the direction in which they had walked appeared when they were asked which way Rose Hill lay, for they pointed almost oppositely to it. Of our compass they had taken early notice and had talked much to each other about it. They comprehended its use and called it Ngā Moro, literally to see the way. A more significant or expressive term cannot be found. April 1791. Supposing ourselves to be higher on the stream than Richmond Hill, we agreed to trace downward, or to the right hand. In tracing, we kept as close to the bank of the river as the innumerable impediments to walking which grow upon it would allow. We found the country low and swampy, came to a native fireplace, at which were some small fish bones. Soon after we saw a native, but he ran away immediately. Having walked nearly 3 miles, we were stopped by a creek which we could neither ford or fall a tree across. We were therefore obliged to coast it, in hope to find a passing place or to reach its head. At 4 o'clock we halted for the night on the bank of the creek. Our natives continued to hold out stoutly. The hindrances to walking by the riverside, which plagued and entangled us so much, seemed not to be heeded by them, and they wound through them with ease. But to us they were intolerably tiresome. Our perplexities afforded them an inexhaustible fund of merriment and derision. Did the sufferer, stung at once with nettle and ridicule, and shaken nigh to death by his fall, use any angry expression to them, they retorted in a moment by calling him by every opprobrious name. Side note: their general favourite term of reproach is gunin pata, which signifies an eater of human excrement. Our language would omit a very concise and familiar translation. They have besides this innumerable others, which they often salute with enemies with. Back to the main text. By calling him by every opprobrious name which their language affords. Balladari destroyed a native hut today, very wantonly, before we could prevent him. On being asked why he did so, he answered that the inhabitants inland were bad, though no longer since than last night, when Beriwan had departed. They were loud in their praise, but now they had reverted to their first opinion, so fickle and transient are their motives of love and hatred. Wednesday, April 13th, 1791. We did not set out this morning until past 7 o'clock, when we continued to trace the creek. The country which we passed through yesterday was good and desirable to what was now presented to us. It was in general high and universally rocky. Toiling our uncouth way, we mounted a hill and surveyed a contiguous country. To the northward and eastward, the ground was still higher than that we were upon, but in a southwest direction we saw about 4 miles. The view consisted of nothing but trees growing on precipices. Not an acre of it could be cultivated. Saw a tree on fire here, and several other vestiges of the natives. To comprehend the reasons which induce an Indian to perform many of the offices of life is difficult. To pronounce that which could lead him to wander amidst these dreary wilds baffles penetration. About 2 o'clock we reached the head of the creek, passed it, and scrambled with infinite toil and difficulty to the top of a neighbouring mountain, whence we saw the adjacent country in almost every direction for many miles. I recalled with regret that this extended view presented not a single gleam of change which could encourage hope or stimulate industry to attempt its culture. We had, however, the satisfaction to discover plainly the object of our pursuit, Richmond Hill, distant about 8 miles, in a contrary direction from what we had been proceeding upon. It was readily known to those who had been up the Hawkesbury in the boats, by a remarkable cleft or notch which distinguishes it. It was now determined that we should go back to the head of the creek and pass the night there, and in the morning cut across the country to that part of the river which we had first hit upon yesterday, and thence to trace upward or to the left. But before I descend, I must not forget to relate that to this pile of desolation, on which, like on the falling angel on top of Nephates, we stood contemplating our nether Eden, His Excellency was pleased to give the name of Tench's Prospect Mount. Our fatigue today had been excessive, but our 2 sable companions seemed rather enlivened than exhausted by it. We had no sooner halted and given them something to eat than they began to play 10,000 tricks and gambols. They imitated the leaping of the kangaroo, sang, danced, poised the spear, and met in mock encounter. But their principal source of merriment was again derived from our misfortunes, in tumbling amidst nettles and sliding down precipices, which they mimicked with inimitable drollery. They had become, however, very urgent in their inquiries about the time of our return, and we pacified them as well as we could by saying it would be soon, but avoided naming how many days. Their method of testifying dislike to any place is singular. They point to the spot they are upon and all around it, crying, "Weary, weary, bad," and immediately after mention the name of any place to which they are attached. Rose Hill or Sydney, for instance, adding to it, Budgery, Budgery, good, nor was their preference in the present case the result of caprice, for they assigned very substantial reasons for such predilection. At Rose Hill, they said, are potatoes, cabbages, pumpkins, turnips, fish, and wine. Here are nothing but rocks and water. These comparisons constantly ended with the question of, where's Rose Hill? Where? On which they would throw up their hands, and utter a sound to denote distance, which it is impossible to convey an idea of upon paper. Thursday, April 14th, 1791. We started early and reached the river in about 2 hours and a half. The intermediate country, except for the last half mile, was a continued bed of stones, which were in some places so thick and close together that they looked like a pavement formed by art. When we got off the stones, we came upon the coarse river sand before mentioned. Here we began to trace upward. We had not proceeded far, when we saw several canoes on the river. Our natives made us immediately lie down among the reeds, while they gave their countrymen the signal of approach. After much calling, finding that they did not come, we continued our progress until it was again interrupted by a creek, over which we threw a tree and passed upon it. While this was doing, a native from his canoe entered into conversation with us, and immediately after paddled to us, with a frankness and confidence which surprised everyone. He was a man of middle age, with an open cheerful countenance, marked with the smallpox, and distinguished by a nose of uncommon magnitude and dignity. He seemed to be neither astonished or terrified at our appearance and number. 2 stone hatchets and 2 spears he took from his canoe and presented to the governor, who in return for his courteous generosity gave him 2 of our hatchets and some bread, which was new to him, for he knew not its use, but kept looking at it until Colby showed him what to do, when he ate it without hesitation. We pursued our course, and to accommodate us, our new acquaintance pointed out a path, and walked at the head of us. A canoe, also with a man and a boy in it, kept gently paddling up abreast of us. We halted for the night at our usual hour on the bank of the river. Immediately that we had stopped, our friend, who had already told us his name, Gombiri, introduced the man and the boy from the canoe to us. The former was named Yellow Mundi, and the later Diemba. The ease with which these people behaved among strangers was as conspicuous as unexpected. They seated themselves at our fire, partook of our biscuit and pork, drank from our canteens, and heard our guns going off around them, without betraying any symptom of fear, distrust, or surprise. On the opposite bank of the river, they had left their wives and several children, with whom they frequently discoursed, and we observed that these last manifested neither suspicion or uneasiness of our designs towards their friends. Having refreshed ourselves, we found leisure to enter into conversation with them. It could not be expected that they should differ materially from the tribes with whom we were acquainted. The same manners and pursuits, the same amusements, the same levity and fickleness undoubtedly characterized them. What we were able to learn from them was that they depend but little on fish, as the river yields only mullets, and that their principal support is derived from small animals which they kill, and some roots, a species of wild yam chiefly, which they dig out of the earth. If we rightly understood them, each man possesses 2 wives. Whence can arise this superabundance of females? Neither of the men had suffered the extraction of a front tooth. We were eager to know whether or not this custom obtained among them, but neither Colby nor Bollidery would put the question for us, and on the contrary showed every desire to waive the subject. The uneasiness which they testified whenever we renewed it rather served to confirm a suspicion, which we had long entertained, that this is the mark of subjection imposed by the tribe of Camaragal, who are certainly the most powerful community in the country, on the weaker tribes around them. Whether the women cut off a joint of one of the little fingers, like those on the sea coast, we had no opportunity of observing. These are petty remarks, but one variety struck us more forcibly. Although our natives and the strangers conversed on a par and understood each other perfectly, yet they spoke different dialects of the same language, many of the most common and necessary words used in life bearing no similitude and others being slightly different. Translation table. The nouns are first in English, then in the sea coast, and then in the Hawkesbury. Moon, Yenida, Kondo and ear, Guri, Benar. Forehead, Nalu, Nalran. Belly, Barang, Bindi. Navel, Maniru, Boombong. Buttocks, Boong. Bailey. Neck, Kalang, Ganga. Thigh, Tara, Dara. Hair, Diwara, Kiwara. End of the table. That these diversities arise from want of intercourse with the people of the coast can hardly be imagined, as the distance inland is but 38 miles, 61 kilometres, and from Rose Hill not more than 20, where the dialect of the seacoast is spoken. It deserves notice that all the different terms seem to be familiar to both parties, though each in speaking preferred its own. Side note, how easily people, unused to speak the same language, mistake each other, everyone knows. We have lived almost 3 years in Port Jackson, for more than half of which period natives had resided with us, before we knew that the word bial signified no and not good, in which later sense we had always used it, without suspecting that we were wrong, and even without being corrected by those with whom we talked daily. The cause of our error was this: the epithet weary, signifying bad, we knew, and as the use of this word and its opposite afford the most simple form of denoting consent or disapprobation to uninstructed Indians, in order to find out their word for good. When Arabanu was first brought among us, we used jokingly to say that anything which he liked was weary, in order to provoke him to tell us that it was good. When we said weary, he answered bial, which we translated and adopted for good, whereas he meant no more than simply to deny our inference and say no, it is not bad. After this, it cannot be thought extraordinary that the little vocabulary inserted in Mr. Cook's account of this part of the world should appear defective, even were we not to take in the great probability of the dialects at Endeavour River and Van Diemen's Land, differing from that spoken at Port Jackson, and it remains to be proved that the animal called here Padagaram is not there called kangaroo. Back to the main text. Stretched out at ease before our fire, all sides continued to chat and entertain each other. Gombury showed us the mark of a wound which he had received in his side from a spear. It was large, appeared to be passed to a considerable depth, and must certainly have been attended with imminent danger. By whom it had been inflicted, and on what occasion, he explained to Colby, and afterwards, as we understood, he entered into a detail of the wars, and as effects lead to causes, probably of the gallantries of the district, for the word which signifies a woman was often repeated. Colby, in return for his communication, informed him who we were, of our numbers at Sydney and Rose Hill, of the stores we possessed, and above all of the good things which were to be found among us, enumerating potatoes, cabbages, turnips, pumpkins, and many other names which were perfectly unintelligible to the person who heard them, but which he nevertheless listened to with profound attention. Perhaps the relation given by Gombury of the cure of his wound now gave rise to the following superstitious ceremony. While they were talking, Colby turned suddenly round and asked for some water. I gave him a cupful, which he presented with great seriousness to Yellamundi, as I supposed to drink. This last indeed took the cup and filled his mouth with water, but instead of swallowing it, threw his head into Colby's bosom, spit the water upon him, and immediately after began to suck strongly at his breast, just below the nipple. I concluded that the man was sick, and called to the governor to observe the strange place which he had chosen to exonerate his stomach. The silent attention observed by the other natives, however, soon convinced us that something more than merely the accommodation of Yalamundi was intended. The ceremony was again performed, and after having sucked the part for a considerable time, the operator pretended to receive something in his mouth, which was drawn from the breast. With this he retired a few paces, put his hand to his lips, and threw into the river a stone, which I had observed him to pick up slowly and secrete. When he returned to the fireside, Colby assured us that he had received signal benefit from the operation, and that this second Makang, a strong and healthy person, had extracted from his breast 2 splinters of a spear, by which he had been formerly wounded. We examined the part, but it was smooth and whole, so that to the force of imagination alone must be imputed both the wound and its cure. Colby himself seemed nevertheless firmly persuaded that he had been received relief, and assured us that Yalamundi was a Ka'adii, or doctor of renown, and Boladuri added that not only he, but all the rest of his tribe were Ka'adii of special note and skill. The doctors remained with us all night, sleeping before the fire in the fullness of good faith and security. The little boy slept in his father's arms, and we observed that whenever the man was inclined to shift his position, he first put over the child with great care and then turned round to him. Friday, April 15th, 1791. The return of light aroused us to the repetition of toil. Our friends breakfasted with us, and previous to starting, Gumburi gave a specimen of their manner of climbing trees in quest of animals. He asked for a hatchet, and one of ours was offered to him, but he preferred one of their own making. With this tool, he cut a small notch in the tree he intended to climb, about 2.5 feet above the ground, in which he fixed a great toe of his left foot and sprung upwards, at the same time embracing the tree with his left arm. In an instant he had cut a second notch for his right toe on the other side of the tree, into which he sprung, and thus alternately cutting on each side, he mounted to the height of 20 feet in nearly as short a space as if he had ascended by a ladder, although the bark of the tree was quite smooth and slippery, and the trunk 4 feet in diameter and perfectly straight. To us it was a matter of astonishment, but to him it was sport, for while employed thus, he kept talking to those below and laughing immoderately. He descended with as much ease and agility as he had raised himself. Even our natives allowed that he was a capital performer, amongst whom they dared not to enter the lists, for as they subsist chiefly by fishing, they are less expert at climbing on the coast than those who daily practice it. Soon after they bade us adieu, in unabated friendship and good humour. Colby and Baladari parted from them with a slight nod of the head, the usual salutation of the country, and we shook them by the hand, which they returned lustily. At the time we started, the tide was flowing up the river, a decisive proof that we were below Richmond Hill. We had continued our march but a short time when we were again stopped by a creek, which baffled all our endeavours to cross it, and seemed to predict that the object of our attainment, though but a few miles distant, would take us yet a considerable time to reach, which threw a damp on our hopes. We traced the creek until 4 o'clock, when we halted for the night. The country on both sides we thought in general unpromising, but it is certainly very superior to that which we had seen on the former creek. In many places it might be cultivated, provided the inundations of the stream can be repelled. In passing along, we shot some ducks, which Baladari refused to swim for when requested, and told us, in a surly tone, that they swam for what was killed, and had the trouble of fetching it ashore, only for the white men to eat it. This reproof was, I fear, too justly founded, for of the few ducks we had been so fortunate as to procure, little had fallen to their share, except of offals and now and then a half-picked bone. True indeed, all the crows and hawks which had been shot were given to them, but they plainly told us that the taste of ducks was more agreeable to their palates, and begged they might hereafter partake of them. We observed that they were thoroughly sick of the journey, and wished heartily for its conclusion. The exclamation of "Where's Rose Hill? Where?" was incessantly repeated, with many inquiries about when we should return to it. Saturday, April 16th, 1791. It was this morning resolved to abandon our pursuit and to return home, at hearing of which our natives expressed great joy. We started early and reached Rose Hill about 3 o'clock, just as a boat was about to be sent down to Sydney. Colby and Ballardery would not wait for us until the following morning, but insisted on going down immediately to communicate to Banilon and the rest of their countrymen the novelties they had seen. The country we passed through was for the most part very indifferent, according to our universal opinion. It is generally badly watered. For 8 miles and a half on one line, it's about 13.5 k's, we did not find a drop of water. Richmond Hill. Having eluded our last search, Mr. Dawes and myself, accompanied by a sergeant of marines and a private soldier, determined on another attempt to ascertain whether it lay on the Hawkesbury or Nepean. We set out on this expedition on the 24th of May, 1791, and having reached the opposite side of the mouth of the creek, which had in our last journey prevented our progress, we proceeded from there up to Richmond Hill by the riverside, mounted it, slept at its foot, and on the following day penetrated some miles westward or inland of it, until we were stopped by a mountainous country, which our scarcity of provisions, joined to the terror of a river at our back, whose sudden rising is almost beyond computation, hindered us from exploring. To the elevation which bounded our research, we gave the name of Night Hill, in honour of the trusty sergeant, who had been the faithful, indefatigable companion of all our travels. This excursion completely settled the long contested point about the Hawkesbury and Nepean. We found them to be one river. Without knowing it, Mr. Dawes and myself had passed Richmond Hill almost a year before in August 1790, and from there walked on the bank of the river to the spot where my discovery of the Nepean happened, in June 1789. Our ignorance arose from having never before seen the hill, and from the erroneous position assigned to it by those who had been in the boats up the river, except the behaviour of some natives whom we met on the river, which would be ingratitude to pass in silence. Nothing particularly worthy of notice occurred on this expedition. When we had reached within 2 miles of Richmond Hill, we heard a native call. We directly answered him, and conversed across the river for some time. At length he launched his canoe and crossed to us without distrust or hesitation. We had never seen him before, but he appeared to know our friend Gombury, of whom he often spoke. He said his name was Didora. He presented us with 2 spears and a throwing stick, and in return we gave him some bread and beef. Finding that our route lay up the river, he offered to accompany us, and getting into his canoe paddled up abreast of us. When we arrived at Richmond Hill, it became necessary to cross the river, but the question was how this should be effected. Didora immediately offered his canoe. We accepted it, and Mr. Dawes and the soldier, putting their clothes into it, pushed it before them, and by alternately wading and swimming soon passed. On the opposite shore sat several natives, to whom Didora called, by which precaution the arrival of the strangers produced no alarm. On the contrary, they received them with every mark of benevolence. Didora, in the meanwhile, sat talking with the sergeant and me. Soon after, another native, named Murunga, brought back the canoe, and now came our turn to cross. The sergeant, from a foolish trick which had been played upon him when he was a boy, was excessively timorous of water, and could not swim. Murunga offered to conduct him, and they got into the canoe together, but his fears returning, he jumped out and refused to proceed. I endeavoured to animate him, and Murunga ridiculed his apprehensions, making signs of the ease and dispatch with which he would land him, but he resolved to paddle over by himself, which, by dint of good management and keeping his position very steadily, he performed. It was now become necessary to bring over the canoe a third time for my accommodation, which was instantly done, and I entered it with Didora. But like the sergeant, I was so disordered at seeing the water within a hair's breadth of the level of our skiff, which brought to my remembrance a former disaster I had experienced on this river, that I jumped out, about knee-deep, and determined to swim over, which I effected. My clothes, half our knapsacks, and 3 of our guns yet remained to be transported across. These I recommended to the care of our grim ferrymen, who instantaneously loaded their boat with them and delivered them on the opposite bank, without damage or diminution. During this long trial of their patience and courtesy, in the latter part of which I was entirely in their power, from their having possession of our arms, they had manifested no ungenerous sign of taking advantage of the helplessness and dependence of our situation, no rude curiosity to pry into the packages with which they were entrusted, or no sordid desire to possess the contents of them, although among them were articles exposed to view, of which it afterwards appeared they knew the use, and longed for the benefit. Let the banks of those rivers, known to song, let him whose travels have lain among polished nations, produce me a brighter example of disinterested urbanity than was shown by these denizens of a barbarous clime, to a set of destitute wanderers on the side of the Hawkesbury. On the top of Richmond Hill we shot a hawk which fell in a tree. Didora offered to climb for it, and we lent him a hatchet, the effect of which delighted him so much that he begged for it. As it was required to chop wood for our evening fire, it could not be conveniently spared, but we promised him that if he would visit us on the following morning, it should be given to him. Not a murmur was heard, no suspicion of our insincerity, no mention of benefits conferred, no reproach of ingratitude. His good humour and cheerfulness were not clouded for a moment. Punctual to our appointment, he came to us at daylight the next morning, and the hatchet was given to him, the only token of gratitude and respect in our power to bestow. Neither of these men had lost his front tooth. The last expedition, which I ever took in the country I am describing, was in July 1791, when Mr. Dawes and myself went in search of a large river, which was said to exist a few miles to the southward of Rose Hill. We went to the place described, and found this second Nile, or Ganges, to be nothing but a salt-water creek, communicating with Botany Bay, on whose banks we passed a miserable night, from want of a drop of water to quench our thirst, for as we believed that we were going to a river, we thought it needless to march with full canteens. On this expedition we carried with us a thermometer, which in unison with our feelings showed so extraordinary a degree of cold for the latitude of the place, that I think myself bound to transcribe it. Monday, July 18th. The sun arose to unclouded splendour, and presented in our sight a novel and picturesque view. The contiguous country, as white as if covered with snow, contrasted with the foliage of trees, flourishing in the verdure of tropical luxuriancy. Side note: all the trees of New South Wales may, I apprehend, be termed evergreen, for after such weather as this journal records, I did not observe either that the leaves had dropped off, or that they had assumed that sickly autumnal tint which marks English trees in corresponding circumstances. Back to the main text. Even the exaltation which steamed from the lake beneath contributed to heighten the beauty of the scene. Wind south-southwest, thermometer at sunrise 25 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 4 degrees Celsius. The following night was still colder. At sunset the thermometer stood at 45 degrees, 7 degrees Celsius. At a quarter before 4 in the morning it was at 26 degrees. At a quarter before 6 at 24 degrees Fahrenheit. At a quarter before 7 at 23 degrees Fahrenheit. At 7 o'clock, 22 and 7. At sunrise, 23 degrees. So that's minus 5 degrees Celsius. After which it continued gradually to mount, and between 1 and 2 o'clock stood at 59 degrees 7 minutes. That's 15 degrees Celsius in the shade. Wind south-southwest. The horizon perfectly clear all day, not the smallest speck to be seen. Nothing but demonstration could have convinced me that so severe a degree of cold ever existed in this lower latitude. Drops of water on a tin pot, not altogether out of the influence of the fire, were frozen into solid ice in less than 12 minutes. Part of a kangaroo leg, which we had roasted for supper, was frozen quite hard, all the juices of it being converted into ice. On these ponds, which were near the surface of the earth, the covering of ice was very thick, but on those which were lower down, it was found to be less so, in proportion to their depression, and wherever the water was 12 feet below the surface, it's 4 meters, which happened to be the case close to us, it was uncongealed. It remains to be observed that the cold of both these nights at Rose Hill and Sydney was judged to be greater than ever before felt. Chapter 15. Transactions of the colony at the end of November 1791. The extreme dryness of the preceding summer has been noticed. It had operated so far in the beginning of June that we dreaded a want of water for common consumption, most of the little reservoirs in the neighbourhood of Sydney being dried up. The small stream near the town was so nearly exhausted, being only the drain of a morass, that a ship could not have watered at it, and the supply was preparing to sink casks in a swamp when rain fell and banished our apprehensions. June 1791. On the 2nd instant, the name of the settlement at the head of the harbour, Rose Hill, was changed, by order of the governor, to that of Parramatta, the native name of it. As Rose Hill has, however, occurred so often in this book, I beg leave to avoid confusion, still to continue the appellation in all future mention of it. June 1791. Our travelling friend Balladari, who makes so conspicuous a figure in the last chapter, about this time committed an offence which we were obliged to notice. He threw a spear at a convict in the woods and wounded him. The truth was, some mischievous person belonging to us had wantonly destroyed his canoe, and he revenged the injury on the first of our people whom he met unarmed. He now seemed to think the matter adjusted, and probably such is the custom they observed in their own society in similar cases. Hearing, however, that an order was issued to seize him, or in case that could not be effected, to shoot him, he prudently dropped all connection with us, and was for a long time not seen. But if they sometimes injured us, to compensate, they were often of signal benefit to those who needed their assistance. 2 instances of which had recently occurred. A boat was overset in the harbour. Bennelong and some other natives, who saw the accident happen, immediately plunged in and saved all the people. When they had brought them on shore, they undressed them, kindled a fire and dried their clothes, gave them fish to eat, and conducted them to Sydney. The other instance was of a soldier lost in the woods, when he met a party of natives. He at first knew not whether to flee from them or to implore their assistance. Seeing among them one whom he knew, he determined to communicate his distress to him, and to rely on his generosity. The Indian told him that he had wandered a long way from home, but that he would conduct him thither, on the single condition of his delivering up a gun which he held in his hand, promising to carry it for him and to restore it to him at parting. The soldier felt little inclination to surrender his arms, by which he would be put entirely in their power, but seeing no alternative, he at last consented, on which the whole party laid down their spears and faithfully escorted him to the nearest part of the settlement, where the gun was given up, and they took their leave without asking for any remuneration, or even seeming to expect it. The distressful state of the colony for provisions continued gradually to augment until the 9th of July, when the Mary Ann transport arrived from England. This ship had sailed from the Downs so lately as the 25th of February, having been only 4 months and 12 days of her passage. She brought our convicts, by contract, at the specific sum for each person. But to demonstrate the effect of humanity and justice, Of 144 female convicts embarked on board, only 3 had died, and the rest were landed in perfect health, all loud in praise of their conductor. The master's name was Munro, and his ship, after fulfilling her engagement with government, was bound on the southern fishery. The reader must not conclude that I sacrifice to dull detail when he finds such benevolent conduct minutely narrated. The advocates of humanity are not yet become too innumerous, but those who practice its divine precepts, however humble and unnoticed be their station, ought not to sink into obscurity, unrecorded and unpraised, with the vile monsters who deride misery and fatten on calamity. July 1791. If, however, the good people of this ship delighted us with their benevolence, here gratification ended. I was of a party who had rowed in the boat 6 miles out to sea, beyond the harbour's mouth, to meet them, and what was our disappointment on getting aboard to find that they had not brought a letter, a few official ones for the governor expected, to any person in the colony, nor had they a single newspaper or magazine in their possession, nor could they conceive that any person wished to hear news, being as ignorant of everything which had passed in Europe for the last 2 years, as ourselves, at the distance of half the circle.
No war, the fleet's dismantled,
was the whole that we could learn. When I asked whether a new parliament had been called, they stared at me in stupid wonder, not seeming to comprehend that such a body either suffered renovation or needed it. Have the French settled their government?
As to that matter, I can't say. I never heard. But damn them, they were ready enough to join the Spaniards against us.
Are Russians and Turkey at peace?
That you see does not lie in my way. I have heard talk about it, but don't remember what passed.
For heaven's sake, why did you not bring out a bundle of newspapers? You might have procured a file at any coffee house, which would have amused you and instructed us.
Why really, I never thought about the matter, until we were off the Cape of Good Hope, when we spoke a man of war, who asked us the same question, and then I wish I had.
To have prosecuted inquiry further would have only served to increase disappointment and chagrin. We therefore quitted the ship, wondering and lamenting that so large a portion of plain, undisguised honesty should be so totally unconnected with a common share of intelligence, and acquaintance with the feelings and habits of other men. By the governor's letters, we learned that a large fleet of transports, with convicts on board, and His Majesty's ship Gorgon, Captain Parker, might soon be expected to arrive. The following intelligence, which they contained, was also made public: that such convicts as had served their period of transportation were not to be compelled to remain in the colony, but that no temptation should be offered to induce them to quit it, as there existed but too many reasons to believe that they would return to former practices, that those who might choose to settle in the country should have portions of land subject to stipulated restrictions, and a portion of provisions assigned to them, on signifying their inclinations, and that it was expected that those convicts who might be possessed of means to transport themselves from the country would leave it free of all encumbrances of a public nature. July 1791. The rest of the fleet continued to drop in this and 2 succeeding months. The state of the convicts whom they brought out, though infinitely preferable to what the fleet of last year had landed, was not unexceptionable. 3 of the ships had naval agents on board to control them. Consequently, if complaint had existed there, it would have been immediately redressed. Exclusive of these, the Salamander, Captain Nichols, who of 155 men lost only 5, and the William and Anne, Captain Bunker, who of 187 men lost only 7. I find most worthy of honourable mention in the list of convicts brought out was Barrington, of famous memory. 2 of these ships also added to our geographic knowledge of the country. The Atlantic, under the direction of Lieutenant Bowen, a naval agent, ran into a harbour between Van Diemen's Land and Port Jackson, in latitude 35 degrees 12 minutes south, longitude 150 degrees east, to which, in honour of Sir John Jervis, Knight of the Bath, Mr. Bowen gave the name of Port Jervis. Here was found good anchoring ground, with a fine depth of water, within a harbour about 1.25 miles broad at its entrance, which afterwards opens into a basin 5 miles wide, it's about 8 kilometres, and of considerable length. They found no fresh water, but as their want of this article was not urgent, they did not make sufficient researches to pronounce that none existed there. Side note, just before I left the country, word was brought by a ship which had put into Port Jervis that a large freshwater brook was found there. Back to the main text. They saw, during the short time they stayed, 2 kangaroos and many traces of inhabitants. The country at a little distance to the southward of the harbour is hilly, but that contiguous to the sea is flat. On comparing what they had found here afterwards with the native produce of Port Jackson, they saw no reason to think that they differed in any respect. The second discovery was made by Captain Weatherhead of the Matilda transport, which was obligingly described to me as follows by that gentleman on my putting to him the unwritten questions. When did you make your discovery?
On the 27th of July, 1791.
In what latitude and longitude does it lie?
In 42 degrees 15 minutes south by observation, and in the 148.5 east by reckoning.
Is it on the mainland, or is it an island?
It is an island, distance from the mainland about 8 miles.
Did you anchor?
Yes, and found good anchorage in a bay open about 6 points.
Did you see any other harbour or bay in the island?
None.
Does the channel between the island and the main appear to afford good shelter for shipping?
Yes, like Spithead.
Did you find any water on the island?
Yes, in plenty.
Of what size does the island appear to be?
It is narrow and long. I cannot say how long. Its breadth is inconsiderable.
Did you make any observations on the soil?
It is sandy, and many places are full of craggy rocks.
Do you judge the productions which you saw on the island to be similar to those around Port Jackson?
I do not think they differ in any respect.
Did you see any animals?
I saw 3 kangaroos.
Did you see any natives or any marks of them?
I saw no natives, but I saw a fire and several huts like those at Port Jackson, in one of which lay a spear.
What name did you give to your discovery?
I called it in honour of my ship, Matilda Bay.
I put it into Google Maps, the coordinates of this Matilda Bay. It seems to say next to Tasmania, but it's not showing on the satellite imagery. Maybe it was a sand island that's eroded over 200 years, I don't know. November 1791. A very extraordinary instance of folly, stimulated to desperation, occurred in the beginning of this month. Among the convicts at Rose Hill, 20 men and a pregnant woman, part of those who had arrived in the last fleet, suddenly disappeared with their clothes, working tools, bedding, and their provisions for the ensuing week, which had been just issued to them. The first intelligence heard of them was from some convict settlers, who said they had seen them pass, and had inquired whither they were bound, to which they had received for answer, to China. The extravagance and infatuation of such an attempt was explained to them by the settlers, but neither derision nor demonstration could avert them from pursuing their purpose. It was observed by those who brought in the account that they had general idea enough of the point of the compass in which China lies from Port Jackson to keep in a northerly direction. An officer with a detachment of troops was sent in pursuit of them, but after a harassing march returned without success. In the course of a week, the greatest part of them were either brought back by different parties who had fallen in with them, or were driven in by famine. Upon being questioned about the cause of their elopement, those whom hunger had forced back did not hesitate to confess that they had been so grossly deceived as to believe that China might easily be reached, being not more than 100 miles distant and separated only by a river. The others, however, ashamed of the merriment excited at their expense, said that their reason for running away was on account of being overworked and harshly treated, and that they preferred a solitary and precarious existence in the woods to a return to the misery they were compelled to undergo. One or two of the party had certainly perished by the hands of the natives, who had also wounded several others. I trust that no man would feel more reluctant than myself to cast an illiberal national reflection, particularly on a people whom I regard in an aggregate sense as brethren and fellow citizens, and among whom I have the honour to number many of the most cordial and endearing intimacies which a life passed on service could generate. But it is certain that all these people were Irish.
Was the chapters 12 to 15 of the book called A Complete Account of the Settlement at Port Jackson by Watkin Tench. Please join me next time when I read through chapters 16 to 19. Until next time, I wish you well.